Disagreement, Guns in America. My name is Nyan Hashe. I'm a professor at Harvard Business School and a longtime community member of the Edmund J. Sapir Center for Ethics. I currently serve as the acting faculty director of the center and co-director of the center's Rapid Response Impact Initiatives. And it's a great pleasure and privilege to welcome you to our discussion today. In 2019, the Edmund J. Sapir Center for Ethics at Harvard started a new series of moderated discussions. And the idea behind these civil disagreement conversations was to bring together policy and subject experts who hold different political viewpoints on urgent current events. And the goal was to model thoughtful, reflective engagement on hard issues with the firm belief that we have much to learn from opposing perspectives and engaging with them. And today's entry in the series is on the controversial subject of gun rights and gun control in America. And the aim of the conversation is to better understand the panelists' different positions on these issues, as well as the experiences, beliefs, and values that animate their positions. And we'd like to extend a special welcome to our Intercollegiate Civil Disagreement Partnership Fellows. These fellows are participating from California State University, Bakersfield, Harvard University, Santa Fe College in Gainesville, Florida, Stanford University, and St. Philip's College in San Antonio, Texas. The Intercollegiate Civil Disagreement Partnership Program is committed to reducing polarization by training student leaders how to engage more productively in difficult conversations and how to facilitate conversations among their peers across political differences. And so for the full academic year, these fellows will work together across their 5 campuses at building these skills, at having hard conversations, and learning how to facilitate those discussions. The ICDP fellows will convene in their own small group conversations tomorrow to dive deeper into the issues that today's discussion will elicit. I'm now pleased to introduce my colleague, Chris Robichaud, who is Senior Lecturer in Ethics and Public Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School, and he's also the Director for Pedagogical Innovation at the Edmund J. Sapir Center for Ethics. And there he oversees our campus collegiate innovation projects, such as the Intercollegiate Discussion Partnership. So Chris will introduce our panelists and serve as our moderator for the event. And so welcome, Chris. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ninha, and hello, everyone. I'm really looking forward to what's sure to be a fantastic conversation this afternoon. Before we begin, I'd like to briefly introduce our wonderful panelists. If you'd like to know more about them, we have more substantial biographies on the page for this event at the Sapir Center's website. That's ethics.harvard.edu. And I'm going to be asking in a moment for our panelists to introduce themselves at some length because it's going to be important for the goals of our conversation. But briefly, first, we have with us Chris Cheng, who is the History Channel's Top Shot Season 4 champion. He's a self-taught amateur turned pro and author of the highly acclaimed book, Shoot to Win. He's also a founding member and advisor to the Asian Pacific American Gun Owners Association. Welcome, Chris. Next of our panelists, we have Simone Gubler, who is assistant professor of philosophy at the University of Nevada. Her work addresses questions in ethics, the philosophy of law, and political philosophy. She's written for popular venues, including the New York Times, on the subject of campus carry policies. Welcome, Simone. We also have Clark Neily, who is a senior vice president for legal studies at the Cato Institute. Clark served as co-counsel in the landmark case on gun rights, the District of Columbia versus Heller, in which the Supreme Court held that the Second Amendment protects an individual's right to keep and bear a gun. This case is back in the news as the Supreme Court just yesterday heard arguments about expanding these rights. He's the author of the book Terms of Engagement, How Our Courts Should Enforce the Constitution's Promise of Limited Government. Welcome, Clark. And last, we have Mayor Maria Rivera, who is the 33rd mayor of Central Falls, Rhode Island. She's the first woman mayor in the city's history and the first Latina mayor in the state of Rhode Island. She's a member of the Mayors Against Illegal Guns Coalition. And among other issues, Mayor Rivera is prioritizing nonviolence and safety in Central Falls. Rhode Island is seen as a leader in gun safety, currently has the 4th lowest rate of gun deaths in the country, which is attributed to tough gun safety laws. Welcome, Mayor Rivera. Want to just briefly, before we jump into the conversation, welcome all of you who are listening to this, and thank you for agreeing to be a part of this conversation. And thanks to the panelists for being a part of this difficult conversation as well. Folks, collectively, our aim is to advance the discussion about guns and safety in America by bringing different voices and perspectives into the conversation. As you can see from this introduction, we've assembled a diverse and deeply informed group of persons with a wide range of experiences to enable this conversation. That said, we want to acknowledge that this panel is not comprehensive. There are many perspectives and views that we weren't able to include. We're asking our panelists to share their own perspectives, their positions, their experiences, and most importantly, we hope that they will urge you to think about yours in conversation with others. We strongly encourage you, and I'll be saying this a few times, we strongly encourage you to submit questions via the questions and answer feature at any point during the event when they come up. And we'll try as best as we can to answer them in the course of this conversation in the hopes of bringing more perspectives in. The last thing I'll just say is my perspective coming into this is I grew up in rural Northeast Ohio. That's also where I spent the past 18 months during this pandemic. I've also spent 20 years here in Cambridge, Massachusetts at MIT and at Harvard. These are two very different worlds when it comes to gun rights in America. And I feel that I have had a lot of opportunities to be exposed to people who have widely divergent views on this. I'm really excited, therefore, to be a part of moderating this conversation. So without further ado, let's jump into it. Panelists, what I'm going to ask you to do, we're going to go around. We're going to ask you to do spend just a couple of minutes telling us a little bit more about what brings you into this space and maybe articulating for our listeners, one or two positions that you hold in the space of gun rights. And I'm just going to go randomly around my screen, which is, I know, different for everyone. But for me, Clark, I see you first. So if you would please begin.
You bet. Well, thanks so much. It's wonderful to be here. I am a libertarian, and I am a libertarian constitutional litigator. I've spent 20 years, most of my legal career, advocating for individuals in court when the government infringes on some liberty that they wish to exercise. As noted, I was one of the architects of the Heller case that went to the Supreme Court. I helped litigate it to the Supreme Court and was sort of the backup quarterback on the day of the argument. I didn't argue the case, but I was ready to. I will say that the Heller case was not fundamentally about guns. I know this because I was one of the two people who came up with the idea to do it, and one of the three people who litigated it. From our perspective, the Heller case was fundamentally about vindicating constitutional rights of all kinds. And our concern was that if you allow the government to infringe one right without a sufficient justification, it won't be long until they're infringing other rights without sufficient justification. And at the end of the day, our perspective is that all people have a right of personal self-defense. You have the right to resist violence against you, and you have a right to do that effectively, whether you're a great big football player or a mixed martial artist on the one hand, or a petite woman with no personal combat training like my wife. So that's really what, from our perspective, the Heller case was about, was vindicating people's constitutional right to effective self-defense.
Thanks, Clark. Mayor Rivera, if you would please share a little bit about yourself and your position in the space.
Thank you, Christopher. So you can probably imagine and think about when I'm running for office. When I started running for office, I'm not thinking of what's going to happen if somebody gets killed in my city because of gun violence, right? Well, that happened in Central Falls when I became mayor. I had the first homicide in this first year, which triggered me to starting to have the conversations and speak to our police department and how can we work with the youth in the city and the police department to figure out how we can take guns out of the street, because I need to keep my community safe. This city has had a homicide due to gun violence every year since 2018. I lived in Chicago, and you can't compare Chicago to the city of Central Falls, but when I travel to Chicago now, you see the differences. I want to make sure that I keep my community safe in Central Falls and that these conversations are happening, because I support the Second Amendment, right? This is not about me not supporting the Second Amendment. It's about how can we work together and make sure that we keep these illegal firearms off of the street and keep our kids and our community safe.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Next on my screen is Simone Gubler. Dr. Gubler, welcome, Simone. And if you'd please share a few thoughts.
Thank you. So I'm a professional philosopher, not someone who ordinarily deals with practical issues like gun control, but my interest in gun control was shaped by two events. So one was, as a child, I grew up in Australia, and a kind of formative experience was watching the process of the introduction of a raft of gun control reforms after a massacre. It was an interesting experience because The process was led by a conservative prime minister. It had buy-in from all of our states. It involved a lot of trust and social cohesion. So there was a big gun buyback from people who are no longer entitled to own certain weapons. And people voluntarily surrendered their weapons. And I have very vivid memories from a young age of watching people on TV walking, up the street to put their guns in piles at police stations. And so that was one experience that kind of shaped my interest in gun culture, and also in how a society that had been kind of defined by a gun culture could come to see that gun culture so readily in response to a kind of a big and tragic event of social consequence. The other event that shaped my interest in gun culture was kind of one that was more personally impactful, which was that when I was a graduate student at the University of Texas and also working as a philosophy instructor in the philosophy program there, Governor Greg Abbott signed into law SB 11, which was a bill that provided for campus carry. So it allowed people to carry concealed weapons onto campus, including into classrooms and including into graduate student offices. And this was something that kind of shaped me as an activist on this issue, because I felt as someone who was teaching that I had certain responsibilities to my students to maintain spaces of inquiry that felt not only safe to them, but also conducive to free expression. And I worried that the presence of guns in classrooms would undermine their enjoyment of kind of free and open expression. And so that's kind of another point at which I became, impassioned about the question of gun culture and gun control. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And Chris Chang, please share with us a little bit about what brings you into this conversation, some of your positions.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. So my name is Chris Chang, and I'm History Channel's Top Shot Season 4 champion. And I got an early start with firearms, and I grew up in Orange County in Southern California. And my father taught me how to shoot at the age of 6. But we didn't have a lot of friends or family, that also owned guns. And so for me, learning how to shoot was this very fun activity. That was a way that my father and I bonded. Now, we didn't shoot very often. We only shot maybe once every 3 or 4 years, punched some holes in paper for an hour or two, and then the guns went back in the safe. And then I didn't see them for maybe 3, 4, 5, 6 years. But then fast forward to my first job, which was at Google here in Silicon Valley. And, combined with, starting my career in tech, and then a few years after that, this show called Top Shot on the History Channel started airing. And it's this marksmanship show, and it's this incredible experience for marksmen from all walks of life, military, law enforcement, hunters, Olympic shooters, and then people like me who are just regular Joes. I mean, I was really a dark horse, an X factor that, kind of shouldn't have been on the show, but I wanted to have a lot of fun. That was really my motivation, was to go have a great time on one of my favorite TV shows. And so, I applied for season 4. Long story short, I trained really hard over 5 months, knowing how much of a knowledge and experience gap that I had. And I really honed in on the finer points of marksmanship. And that's what got me over the finish line. I beat 17 competitors, won the title of Top Shot, $100,000 cash prize, and a pro shooting contract with Bass Pro Shops. And so in 2012, I left my job at Google and joined the firearms industry full time, not really knowing what I was going to do. My now husband, then boyfriend at the time, I was a little concerned because, like, how am I going to make a living? And I told him, look, there's few moments in one's life where we can just pivot into a completely new industry, be entrepreneurial and figure it out. And so that's what I did. And, for the past 10 years, I've learned so much about gun culture, because 10 years ago, I wasn't really a gun guy. Yes, I shot guns and I could shoot guns, sure, but I didn't really consider myself a part of the gun community. I definitely did not consider myself a Second Amendment advocate. But after digging through all of these just unique layers, from the policy angle, the politics, the culture, the people, the constitutionality of what the Second Amendment is all about. For me, living and breathing this experience of being a gun owner, being a Second Amendment advocate, and for me, it's really about being a civil rights advocate. That the Second Amendment for me is just one of many civil rights that I speak out on and defend. And for me, when I think about gay rights, being a gay man, gay rights and gun rights go hand in hand. For me, being a targeted minority, firearms are one of the key ways that I see, that I use to exercise my natural right to self-defense. So I'll leave it at that. I'm looking forward to many of the great questions and upcoming discussion here on the panel.
Well, we've already staked out some controversial positions, and I appreciate that for everyone. And I want to, again, before we jump into some of the questions that I have, want to remind all listeners, please, as questions come up on your part over this, please use the Q&A function to put those questions out there. We will circle back around on them towards the second half of this. So thank you all very much for those introductions. Thank you for giving our listeners a little bit more sense about how you come into this. I'm just going to start us off with a couple of questions. This first one is going to be firstly directed, Simone and Maria, toward you. What I'm trying to do, and then the second one will be directed more towards Clark and Chris, but everyone is going to be invited to come in. What I'm trying to do is to generate some questions that I've heard on either side of this to challenge folks. And so if I'm wearing one hat, and that's the hat that I would wear, born and raised in rural Ohio, a version of what I hear often goes something like this. There is too much tolerance by some people who want to advocate for stricter gun laws for pushing up against our constitutional rights. A version of this goes something like, I'm for the Second Amendment, but ... And then here comes a bunch of interventions that suggests that you may not be recognizing that this is a constitutional right. The thought behind this is the founders felt that it was so important to say something about arms that they put it in as number 2 of the amendments. How do we reconcile that seriousness of treating this as a right with what we may consider to be robust attempts to limit gun ownership? So I'm hoping that surfaces the tension that I'm hearing from some circles saying, if it's a constitutional amendment, why are we having a conversation about this gun law or that gun law? It's a right. Simone, I'm going to start with you as a response to that, and then Mayor Maria Rivera, I'll turn to you, and then others please join in as we go along. Yeah.
Okay, great, thank you. That's a great question. In response, I'd say, first of all, it's not entirely clear what the Second Amendment provides for. Lots of legal scholars on both the right and the left take it to be compatible with some degree of gun control. Certainly not the case that it precludes all gun control. But I think the response that I'm more attracted to is just that, we need to talk about the justification of any application of the Second Amendment that we opt for. Because the founding fathers didn't take themselves to be infallible, right? The existence of amendments to the Constitution, a power to amend, right, which they provided for, suggests that the Constitution was taken by the founding fathers to be imperfect, to be something capable of amendment, to be something that might justifiably change over time in response to changing social needs. And so I think we have to be really careful of a kind of fetishism about the Constitution that we have. And we need to keep asking the question of justification. We need to keep asking, does this existing document work for us? Does it respond to the needs that we have? Is it responsive to the world that we live in? And I think some of the justifications for including the Second Amendment may have lapsed, right? Others obviously remain pertinent. I know that Clark mentioned the right to self-defense. That's obviously something that remains an important consideration in any liberal culture. It's an interesting, important right with roots in the natural rights tradition that could supply the Second Amendment with justification. But I'm not convinced by arguments that just consist in waving the Constitution at us as if it were some document of religious authority, because I think that once we accept it as such, we've lost our claim to live in a democratic society where the people get to determine the norms that they live under.
Thanks, Simone. Mayor Rivera, I wanted you to be able to join this as well. And then Clark and Chris, I'm sure you'll have some responses that you want to say.
Yeah, so I'll say this again. I support the Second Amendment, but we have irresponsible gun owners, right? So previously, or data shows that if you have a person that has a gun that uses that gun, they'll shoot 5 times, right? If somebody has a military weapon or a bazooka, who's gonna survive when they're shooting at someone? Not the person that's being shot at that has the bazooka or the military gun, because they have how many? Like 100 clips. That's my argument with this. It's the irresponsible people who are purchasing these guns, and some way, somehow, they're going into the hands of these individuals that are going around killing people. So, there's a loophole. This is about a conversation. So on my end, this is not about, I support Second Amendment or I don't support Second Amendment. It's about, we need to fill in that gap and talk about what has to happen to fill that gap that we have, so that these gun owners don't let these rifles or whatever guns they have get out of their hands and go into the hands of people that are just gonna go crazy killing people.
Thank you for that, Mayor Rivera. Clark, let me bring you in, and then Chris as well. Some responses to what you've heard.
So I think the easy thing is to say, well, look, all constitutional rights have limits. And of course, that's true. Even the First Amendment right to free speech has limits. The hard thing is to figure out, what do we really mean? How do we go about thinking about what those limits are and working them out, in reality, when the rubber hits the road. One example would be whether, for example, it is permissible to eliminate somebody or take away somebody's Second Amendment right to own a gun simply because they've been convicted of a felony. That's a tough one, because historically, in the old days, felonies meant something. Like, you were a bad person, you killed somebody, or you burned down their house. The government these days has completely trivialized the concept of felony. I would say that probably most of the people listening to this podcast have committed a felony. I know I have. I just haven't been convicted of one. And so that would be an example of something we'd have to really try to work out and get down to the nitty gritty. And, Simone said something about the justification of any application of the Second Amendment. And I think it's really important to be clear what we're talking about here, and whether we're talking about requiring somebody who proposes to engage in non-morally wrongful behavior, like just carrying a gun around. That doesn't violate anybody's rights. It could, but it doesn't if you're not doing anything with a gun besides carrying it around, or at least so I would argue. One of the biggest and most important questions in constitutional law when it comes to individual rights is, who bears the burden? Do I bear the burden of justifying why I want to carry a gun, or why I want to marry a particular person, or I want to live with certain people? Or does the government bear the burden of justifying the infringement or the limitation of my liberty? And the Supreme Court has not been consistent on that. With some rights, the person who wishes to exercise the right and engage in the conduct bears the burden of trying to demonstrate to the government why they should be able to do so. But in other cases, the Supreme Court requires the government to carry the burden of justifying the restriction of a particular liberty. And right now, we don't know which of those two baskets the Second Amendment and gun ownership will fall into, because the Supreme Court hasn't told us. It's pretty clear they're leaning towards requiring the government to justify the restriction or infringement of gun rights, but they haven't said so explicitly yet. So that remains to be seen.
Thanks for that, Chris. I'm going to bring you in a second. I just want to turn this to Simone for 1 minute. And that's because as I'm listening, I'm trying to put some of these threads together. So Clark, you said some many things worth discussing, but one thing you said that, Simone, I thought you may want to speak to is, Clark, if I heard you right, you said, just carrying around a gun doesn't violate anyone's rights. It could, but in and of itself, it doesn't. Simone, since I know that you have been in this exact space thinking about open carry, did you want to speak to any of that? And then Chris, I promise I'm going to circle back with you.
Yeah, well, I think, the way that I've thought about how carrying a gun might not necessarily constitute maybe a violation of my rights, but certainly infringe my exercise of my rights in some way, it comes up in kind of with respect to questions of discourse. So when I thought that in my classroom, students might plausibly be carrying guns, that had an impact on the way in which I facilitated conversations. That had an impact on how far I was willing to let, kind of like hot debates go in the classroom. And I think that was sad. I mean, I think it was kind of injurious to a space of inquiry that should be free and open. And so I think there are real tensions between the First Amendment and the Second Amendment. And there are interesting questions about what a society in which, guns proliferate looks like as a space of discourse and as a space of free and open inquiry.
I'm going to put a pin in that. I love it. Clark, I may circle back with you on whether there's this tension between First and Second Amendments. But Chris, thank you very much for your patience. Please jump in.
One thing that I think is interesting to note when we look at the literal text of the Second Amendment is that it is the only amendment that has 4 particular words, which are shall not be infringed. And this is something that struck me as really interesting when I started digging a little bit deeper into gun culture, into Second Amendment advocacy. All right, so these 4 words, shall not be infringed, for many of us are taken quite literally. Now, I think when I look back at my 20 years of LGBT advocacy, and I think about, back in 2008, right here in California, right, we voted to ban same-sex marriage. And for me, like, that was a huge turning point because I just saw that as a tremendous affront to my civil liberties as a gay American. And for me, this was a 0 or 100, kind of, it was like 0 or 1, right? It's like all or nothing. And for me, the fight for gay rights was all about marriage equality. And thankfully in 2015, marriage equality became law of the land. And so when I think about, again, I equate gay rights and gun rights as civil rights. And so, I'm typically pretty moderate on a lot of issues, but I think when it comes to gay rights and gun rights, I'm much more in the, hey, I don't think the government really has a strong place or a strong argument to really regulate how we should be protecting ourselves. And I guess it comes to my second comment here, which is to address one thing that the mayor noted. I mean, to clarify, she mentioned bazookas and military weapons. We're not seeing bazookas and military weapons out on the streets. These aren't the weapons that are being used in mass shootings. So I just wanted to clarify that, right? Like the debate is not about military weapons and bazookas. It's about civilian grade, weapons such as AR-15s and other standard rifles and pistols and shotguns that are commonly in use, that are owned by almost 100 million of Americans, own firearms. There's almost 400 million firearms here in the United States. So I just wanted to put that out there for discussion and consideration.
Mayor Rivera, I'm going to come to you now, and I promise to pick up that other thread. I want this to go on for hours. I know we can't do that. This was all the way from the first question, but Mayor Rivera, 2 things on that. First is I'd like you opportunity to respond to Chris and maybe elaborate upon the sorts of guns that you are targeting when you're thinking about laws that would limit gun ownership. But also, I'm really curious, as a mayor, as an elected government official, Chris has put forth now a couple of times this controversial idea, right? And Chris, I really love that you've done so, right? Which is an equation, a tight knitting together of gay rights and gun rights. I think I'm getting that right, Chris, as you've said it. Mayor, do you agree with that the interconnectedness of those 2 rights?
I have to say that I do. I agree on that part with him. I have to tell you that with military weapons and bazookas, these are conversations that are happening. These are weapons that people have access to.
So my understanding, I'm sorry, is my understanding though, so aside from, so we'll leave for a minute the question about whether military grade or bazookas are being, are at the forefront of our thinking. It's an empirical question. I'm not in a position to know for sure. I'll take both of you of having different views on this. But Mayor, I have to ask you to elaborate a little bit, because that would seem substantial to agree that the promotion of gay rights includes the promotion of gun rights. Can you elaborate on how you agree with that?
Let's go back, right? I am 100% supportive of the gay community, marriage equality, all of that happened here. So I might be confused with what he was trying to say. I support our LGBTQ community 100%. I'm not sure what he's trying to say on how you combine these two things together because it's two separate subjects,
Great.
right?
Okay.
So
Yeah,
they
let
have
me
rights,
clarify.
he has
My
rights,
position is that I don't think that the government has a place in regulating whether marriage is between a man and a woman, two men, two women. And similarly, I don't think the government has a strong place or position to be regulating the type of firearms that law-abiding, responsible gun owners, should be able to own and use in our country. Now, Mayor, I think where we do agree is that we want to keep firearms out of the hands of irresponsible people, right? And make sure that we're encouraging responsible, safe storage of existing firearms. And I guess, like, for me, like, what the heart of this whole conversation often comes down to the gun control laws that are often discussed are disproportionately discriminating against law-abiding gun owners and will not have a meaningful impact against criminal ownership and usage of those firearms.
Thanks,
Okay,
Chris.
so
Mayor, I want to give you a chance to respond.
So I'd have to disagree because the LGBT community that we're supporting for marriage rights and other conversations that we're having, they're not hurting people. They're not killing people. The conversations we have about guns are happening because of the amount of people that are dying because of the gun violence.
That's actually a great segue to my second question, but so I want to put a pin in that. We will come back to that, and that will be a question that I level at Clark and Chris first. So thank you, Mayor. I think my second question, I think we'll cut to the heart of that, and then I'll ask you and Simone if you want to respond to what you've just heard. But I promised Clark you an opportunity to respond to Simone's claim here, which I also thought was really interesting, which is there's a tension between the Second Amendment and the First Amendment, and that open carry laws, for instance, may quell the ability to have civil engagement.
Yeah, listen, I credit that concern. I'm a fellow University of Texas alum. My good friend Tara Smith is a philosopher at University of Texas. I know that she shares some of these concerns. So I think that absolutely can be true. But then the question becomes, is it a sufficiently sort of tangible or empirical concern that it would empower the government to require that some people who feel equally strongly about their right to protect themselves, divest themselves of the means to do so. And I think there can be a tendency to fetishize guns a little bit. I have 3 black belts in martial arts, and I'm perfectly capable of hurting somebody without a gun, and people can carry a knife around with them, or all kinds of different weapons that if they disagreed with somebody during some discourse, if they were prone to violence, they don't need a gun in order to inflict violence on other people. And in my experience, people who've gone to the trouble of getting a license in jurisdictions where that's required, of doing the kind of training that Chris has done, that requires a tremendous amount of discipline and self-control. And they are among the least likely people, in my judgment, to resort to sudden violence just because they disagree with somebody. So I think both things are true. I absolutely credit the concern. I don't really love being in a heated discussion with somebody I know to be armed. It can be uncomfortable, but I think that it's not entirely rational because people who, again, have fulfilled the requirements and the responsibilities to be armed tend to be people who've demonstrated tremendous amounts of self-control and discipline, and are, in my judgment, the least likely people to resort to violence. And I'm talking again about lawful gun owners here. So I think, I credit those perspectives, but we got to remember that there are definitely two perfectly legitimate, I shouldn't say perfectly, let me say two legitimate interests in tension here.
Great, Clark. Simone, I'm going to give you the last chance to respond to that briefly, and then I'm going to throw out my second question here. But I'm really loving this exchange. So I just thought we'd have one last thought on that, especially if we don't have time to circle back around. Simone, please. Thanks, Clark.
Yeah, no, I take that point, and of course, it's an empirical question whether or not any of the people who have gun licenses present a threat to their fellow citizens. But I still feel pretty strongly that those of us who aren't carrying guns. And maybe who aren't as familiar with gun culture, right? And maybe who aren't as familiar with the requirements for certification can have reasonable fears and discomfort about the presence of a holstered weapon in a heated conversation. And I actually think this is a particularly kind of acute question when it comes to university students, because as a pedagogue, I love my students, but impulse control is not one of the things that, I go to them for. And so, all due respect to people who have licenses, I don't necessarily credit the point that that young people in spaces of discourse are kind of like ideal citizens when it comes to gun ownership or control. And I think it would be reasonable for people to have fears that they weren't. But yeah, thank you.
So next question. This is awesome. This one, Chris, is going to come to you first, and then Clark, and then May Rivera and Simone, if you would like to chime in. But I think the way into this one. So we started with what I tried to channel was a concern from folks who are advocates of robust gun rights. It's the Second Amendment. Why are we talking about curtailing it? This comes from the other direction. The way I want to go into this is actually from The Onion, the satirical newspaper, The Onion. Often The Onion has biting satire that's not so much funny as it is just simply biting satire. And one of their meta satirical things, I'm sure everyone part of this conversation knows this, but I want to just name it, is every time there is another mass shooting in the United States, they run this same satirical article that they did years and years ago. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but it's a headline that says, "No way to prevent this. Says only nation where this regularly happens," right? It's sort of that gallows dark kind of humor, but the meta humorous point, and it's not funny in that sense, you understand what I'm saying, I hope, is they've run this out close to 20 times. Every time there's a mass shooting, The Onion rolls this out, it cuts and pastes the different names and so forth. This has been recognized. There's actually, I looked this up today, there's actually a Wikipedia entry on this piece from The Onion. Of course, what The Onion is making us do is to say, how can this be unpreventable when we are the only nation that seems to have this on a regular basis? I feel that behind that is the following question, and Chris and Clark, I'm going to put this to you. Rights aside, this country seems to be very good at creating carnage with gun violence. And many of us have interacted with people, I know I certainly have, who have been around victims of gun violence or have been victims of gun violence themselves. This goes on with such great regularity that The Onion can run close to 20 times this piece in a macabre, sort of dark gallows humor kind of way every time that there's another act like this. How in the world do we reconcile the rights to gun ownership with the litany of carnage that seems to be in the wake of acts of gun violence? Crystal, I'm going to have you start with that.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think the first thing to note is, every time that there's either a mass shooting or someone is, injured or killed with a firearm, gun owners like me, we look at these incidents with the same amount of abject horror and disgust that the rest of the country has. And so, this is not about, I think, an accusation that is often hurled at responsible gun owners is that, Chris and other gun owners aren't willing to give up their AR-15s, in exchange for saving lives, right? Like that. And so let me flip that around, right? So when I hear that, I think about, well, I'm not doing anything irresponsible with my firearms. My firearms are secure. I'm not the one encouraging violence. So why is all of the negativity, why is all of the legislation that's being discussed targeted at people like me who are just responsible gun owners who have nothing to do with any of this violence that's happening right throughout our country? So to the crux of the question though, right, it's like, well, what do we do, right? How do we move forward? When we talk about gun violence, I think there's a disproportionately high focus on the gun part and not enough focus on the violence part. So if you can imagine for a second, look, if we were all in a room and there were loaded firearms, sitting on a table, just sitting there waiting for anybody to grab them and go and commit violence, well, look, chances are pretty high no one's going to commit any crime, right, with those guns, right? So if you sort of accept that sort of, that's very simple example, then if we turn our attention to, well, what makes people violent? right? What makes them want to commit crimes, go kill, go injure people? We need to look at the interrupters, right? What are the multiple factors that go into creating or facilitating violence within communities and violence between communities? So that's my initial thought here. Clark, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Chris. Clark?
Yeah, I mean, look, it is so tragic when this happens. And of course, there's a desire to think, well, if we just had better policies, then we could end mass shootings. I think there are two basic problems with this Onion headline. The first is that it is factually false. I'm going to read you a list of all the countries in the world that have a higher rate of death in from 2009 to 2015 than the United States per million people. Norway, Serbia, France, Macedonia, Albania, Slovakia, Switzerland, Finland, Belgium, and the Czech Republic. Now, we're a big country, and we're a big country that has more guns in private ownership than any other country in the world. So we know that there will be shootings. That's inevitable. But the idea that America, is sort of orders of magnitude, sort of worse than other countries, and that sort of mass shootings are happening constantly all over the place, is a myth. Mass shootings appear to have been on the uptick slightly in the last 15 to 20 years, but we've always had mass shootings, and so have other countries. And if you look at total gun violence, America is not nearly as violent as many countries in the world, such as Honduras, Brazil, Mexico, and Russia. So there's a bit of, I think, a misportrayal there. The second part is the sort of the tacit assertion or assumption in that headline that if we would just pass a law, then we could fix all this. Imagine if we substituted, instead of mass shootings, we substituted opiate overdoses, right? We had a massive spike in deaths by opiate overdoses. We're about 93,000 last year. So how snarky and fun would it be to have a headline that says, it happened again, says the only country where people die of opiate overdoses. And if we would just pass a law, then obviously we could prevent all those deaths. And the truth of the matter is that it's not that obvious. When you have any kind of a really intractable public policy problem like this, whether it's suicides or homicides by gun violence or people having overdoses, the problem, everybody's committed to trying to fix that problem. And what's challenging about it is it's not as simple as just passing a law. It's not as simple as just saying, well, if everybody would just give up their assault weapons, then we wouldn't have mass shootings. That's just false. And I understand there's some catharsis in the satire, but it's based on two factually dubious and I would say actually false premises, unfortunately.
Thanks, Clark. Mayor Rivera, I know that you've worked in this space and reduction of gun violence. So please join in.
So I have to agree, legislation is not going to solve this problem. I feel like it's either a yes or too many people to the left or too many people to the right. Nobody's talking about mental health. Like, people that are doing this, are getting these guns, they have mental health issues that nobody's having conversations about. When we have an issue here in Central Falls, it's not just about, okay, this person got killed because of gun violence, let's have a memorial and let's leave the conversation there. I took it upon myself to make sure I had my full police department trained in nonviolence so that they can work with youth. I have a non-violent youth worker that works with youth tries and works with the youth who are having issues, who have to come into the police for whatever reason, to try to take them away from having guns, from thinking about what's their next step. Their friend was killed. The person who was just killed in Central Falls, we had about 100 people there. What are these kids doing? They're trying to get revenge. Where are they going to get guns from to give revenge? So it's about, we also have to have conversations on how to work with our youth and our community to make sure that they know that that's not the solution to issues. And we're not having conversations about that. So I completely support all the gun legislation that's happening, but that's not the solution that's going to solve this problem. There's a lot more that has to be done to solve this.
All right, Simone, I want to bring you in this. I might circle back myself. Thank you, Mayor.
Okay, thank you. So in my opening remarks, I mentioned the Port Arthur massacre, which was an event that happened in Australia 25 years ago, in which 35 people were killed by someone with 2 semi-automatic weapons. after that, a comprehensive raft of gun control reforms were introduced, and we haven't had a massacre of that magnitude since. And so I think that we shouldn't be too quick to dismiss legal responses to problems of gun violence. And I think it's worth noting that at least this year, it does look like gun violence is on the rise. There's a 9% increase over reports from last year, figures from the 1st of January to the 15th of September. During the same period, there were 498 mass shootings in the United States, which strikes me like a sign of a pretty consequential social problem. But I am sympathetic to what the other panelists are saying about the limitations of legal reform. I don't think we should discount the possibilities of legal reform, but I think that there's obviously a deeper cultural question that needs to be addressed here as well. And I think it's kind of interesting to think about whether the focus on legal measures distracts us from other levers that we could be using to reform America's problems with gun violence. So I take what Mayor Rivera said about mental illness, the lack of social provision for people in distress in this country quite seriously. I think that any comprehensive approach to the problem of violence needs to take these questions into account as well, and it shouldn't be an either or kind of proposition.
Great, thank you, Simone. Clark, you wanted to speak to the Australia point, is that right?
Yeah, so it is true that Australia passed very stringent gun control measures after the Port Arthur massacre in Hobart. What's less clear is whether it did anything good, whether it had any correlation to any, sort of desirable public policy outcome. Australia is a very small country compared to the United States, not even 1/10 our population. If you look at the empirical literature and the studies that have been done, and there have been a lot of them, I would say that the consensus that emerges is that the legislation in Australia had no effect on gun suicides, which of course are the primary cause of gun deaths. And it's most of the researchers, at least that I have read, say that there's no evidence that it had any effect on the homicide rate either. The gun homicide rate in Australia was already falling when that legislation was enacted. They had other legislation that they enacted in 1991 that may have been even more helpful than the 1996 kind of assault weapon ban that they had effectively in Australia. So I think we got to be careful about overstating the effects of gun legislation, which I know that Simone was careful to do. But it is common for people to hold up the Australian experience to suggest that, if we just get the right legislation on the books and we take away the right weapons from the right people, then like Australia, we won't have any more mass shootings. And I just don't think that follows, and I don't think the evidence bears it out.
Simone, I want you to have a quick moment for a quick follow-up if you'd like. Being Australian, right? I feel that, that has to happen. And then Chris, you wanted to speak to some of the comments that the mayor had made. Yeah. Simone, please.
No, I mean, I think the proof is in the pudding. The fact that we haven't had a major massacre in that period is a fairly important one. I'd say that the population of Australia is roughly the same as the population of Texas, and Texas has significantly more mass shootings every year than Australia encounters, and so I think we can run these comparisons. But again, I think it's a cultural question, and one of the reasons that the Australian model has been so successful is because of the trust and cohesion in the Australian population. I mean, it's not as polarized a country as the United States is, and I really. The images of people voluntarily surrendering their guns were moving images, not necessarily because it's giving up, guns, but because people work together to find a solution to a perceived social problem. And I think that any positive change that's going to happen in the US needs to be supported by the same sort of relations of trust and cohesion and kind of like political amity that obtained in the Australian case, and that's hard to see. So that's kind of worrisome. Yeah.
I was going to say, Simone, if that's the case, we're in trouble because there's not much of that. It seems to me to go around. Chris, please, you wanted to speak to some of the mayor's comments.
Yeah, so the mayor brought up a really good point. When she mentioned the example that a lot of these youths that she's hearing from are exacting revenge on either each other or other groups, and they're using firearms to do that. And it made me think about this mantra that is often repeated within the gun community, which is education, not legislation, right? To have the government kind of, step aside a little bit here and let communities really take control of the narrative and the conversation and really focus on the people, right? Don't focus so much on the guns, but let's focus on the people. Not to say don't focus on the guns at all, but again, but to reiterate an earlier point, I think we invest so much time and energy fighting each other on very polar opposite legislative solutions. Right, we had a federal assault weapons ban from 1994 to 2004, and the Obama DOJ, they did an analysis of that 10-year assault weapons ban, and they basically concluded that it wasn't impactful, and that the only way that it would be more impactful is if it went farther and created a gun registry and basically forced everybody to turn in their assault weapons. So, that's like an untenable position, for a lot of gun owners, for Second Amendment advocates. And so to bring it back to the mayor's comments, right, about, if we could focus on more valuable life skills such as conflict resolution, de-escalation, and negotiation, these are ways that you can have, instead of youth going to a gun, right, to think that's going to solve a problem, that they can actually talk about it. They can actually find a way to maybe either work together with adversaries or at least find a peaceful way of disengaging with adversaries. And so that I think is more of the kind of work that a lot of Second Amendment advocates support. 100% agree on the mental health aspect and focus as well. And I think if we, again, fought less and try to work together more and put our time and money and energy and attention into community-based, mental health solutions, I think that will go a lot farther than the current political and legislative debate around the Second Amendment and guns in America.
Thanks, Chris. Mayor, I'm going to wrap up with you on this. In the interest of the spirit of what Chris is saying strikes me as quite nice, but I do want us to have a civil disagreement. And so, Mayor, I thought
I can agree and disagree with what he just said.
Please, take it away. Thank you. Yeah.
I completely agree 100% with the education part, right? We can't have a conversation about trying to fix something or change something without education being part of it. Because if we don't have solutions for certain things, it's never going to work out. But I do agree that we need to pass legislation for safer gun laws.
So Mayor, I was going to follow up on that as well. So say a few words about that, if you will, because that is a clear point of disagreement.
Yeah, I believe in reducing access to illegal firearms. The Second Amendment allows people to go and buy firearms that I don't think they should have access to.
So I'm going to pause us there and turn to some of the Q&A. We're getting some amazing questions from everyone who's listening. Thank you all. We only have a little over a half hour left. So I'm going to share some of these questions, and then whoever would like to jump in first, and we'll just go around. Again, I really want to appreciate the wonderful questions that are coming in. We may not get to all of them, and I apologize for that, but there's some really wonderful stuff. So this first question is coming from one of our listeners, Angela. And she asks this, and we haven't really focused on the safety issue, which is one of the reasons why I think this is a good one to surface a little bit. Can I ask this is Angela, can I ask what it means to equate, as some people do, gun rights with self-defense? It seems to me that concealed carry may carry a threat of intimidation as well as an arms race to who carries the largest gun. Are there better ways of self-defense? Simone, do you want to start with this, since it speaks a little bit to the space that you've been thinking about, and then we'll bring others in. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, I think that it's interesting, right? There's no necessary relationship between having a gun and realizing one's right to self-defense. Self-defense is multiply realizable. As Clark has pointed out, right? I can train in martial arts, I can train in rhetoric, I can do all sorts of things that are going to make me a more efficient self-defender. And so we might wonder why this intimate association of guns and self-defense. And I wonder sometimes about the emphasis on self-defense. Like, I wonder what's happened, that so many of us feel the need to have and carry weapons. When we live in what is ostensibly a society, with protections and a state that's supposed to look after us. I mean, the right to self-defense is one of these things that's often, associated back to the natural rights tradition. to people like Hobbes and Locke. It's an interesting, important right in that context. But in that tradition, it's one of the first rights that we cede in order to form a social compact. And many classical conceptions of the state hold the state to have a monopoly on violence and on justice, right? We cede rights to vigilantism when we enter into organized life. And so I think that one thing that worries me is why we feel the need for violent self-defense. That says that there's something dysfunctional about the relationship that we're in, with the state that we're in. And then the second point, I guess, is that it's not clear that guns are necessary to facilitate self-defense. So I think it's entirely fine for us to take away some possible tools to facilitate self-defense, right? No one, would probably raise a stink if I was not allowed to build a trebuchet in my backyard, or if I wasn't allowed to surround my property with poisonous snakes. And the mayor's mentioned military weapons. Clearly, the right to self-defense isn't limitless, and so the question is just, where should we place those limits? What tools are legitimate for us to employ in a democratic society in order to realize that right? And also, why? Why do we feel so vividly in this country that this is a question for us, that self-defense is not something that we're assured of by all of the institutions that exist to protect us.
Thanks, Simone. Clark, I know that some of the things that Simone mentioned spoke to some of your comments earlier, so I thought this would be a good back and forth if you're interested.
Well, we are now going to have really strong disagreement, but it's going to be civil. The idea that you can effectively defend yourself without a gun is a fantasy. As I said, I've studied martial arts for most of my life. I have 3 black belts. I absolutely would never try to defend myself against somebody who is wielding a weapon of any kind against me just with those skills. And no responsible martial arts instructor would tell you to try to defend yourself against somebody, and not just with another gun, with any kind of weapon, a 2x4, a knife, anything else. It's just not how it works. So one of the sort of rhetorical aspects of this discussion is that on the one hand, people who support greater gun regulation will talk about how violent our society is and how many people get killed with guns and how scary it is. But you can't have your cake and eat it too. You can't sit there and say, well, our society is really violent. And we are, compared to other liberal democracies. We definitely are, at least when it comes to homicides. There are others like Great Britain that are nearly as violent in other categories. But then turn around and say, and sort of wave your hand at people's desire to be able to defend themselves against sudden violence. And I'll just add one more thing, and I know Chris is going to elaborate on this because it came up earlier in our pre-conversation. One of the things I've found as somebody who's been in this area for a long time is that people who support greater gun regulation are surprisingly unfamiliar with the voluminous literature on this thing called defensive gun uses, or DGUs. This is a subject that has been studied exhaustively in terms of how often people use guns to protect themselves from violent crime. And I'll leave it to Chris to elaborate further, but I will say that it is amazing how many people are unaware of this voluminous literature and unaware of the consensus that has emerged that really no responsible scholar that I'm aware of disputes, which is that guns in private hands are used far more often to protect people from violent crime than they are to commit violent crime. And again, that doesn't make it true, but it is the consensus of all responsible social scientists that I'm aware of. And this is an issue that has been studied exhaustively. So bottom line, yeah, guns are dangerous, but they're also extremely useful for certain people.
Chris, I'm going to let you follow up, and then Simone, of course, I'm going to give you an opportunity to respond. And Mayor Rivera, I will circle you back in as well. But we're getting to some meat of the issue right now. So Chris, please.
Yeah, I'd love to address Simone's question around why, right? And I think 2 things come to mind when I heard her asking this great question. The first one is, I often think about, and again, I'm going to make another parallel to the gay rights movement, that I think until you meet or know someone who is a part of the LGBT community, it's very hard to understand, right? Like what our story, like what our lives are about. And it's very similar with gun owners, or in this case, the second part is victims of violence. And so 2 quick examples here. One's a friend and one is a colleague in the gun community. The first example is one of my colleagues. She is about 5 foot, 100 pounds, and she was the victim of domestic violence from her former husband. Her former husband put a gun to her head in front of their young child, and he threatened to kill her. And she wasn't armed, and she became a gun owner because she never wanted to be put in that position again where she could not protect her own life, nor could she protect the life of her young child. The second example is my other friend who was a victim of sex trafficking. She's from Florida. She basically got drugged at a club. She woke up in a van, hogtied, and she had a gun held to her face and told, "You're going to do what we all tell you to do." And basically she was prostituted against her will for a number of months. And when she finally got free of her captors, she decided she would never again wanted to be a victim, and therefore she got a firearm. She is now a firearms trainer, and she focuses on women's self-defense. And she's also small frame. She's about 4'10", 100 pounds. And the thing about a firearm, the thing that makes a firearm so unique in this conversation, is that it is an equalizer, right? A woman who is 4'10" and 100 pounds can at least stand a chance against a man who's 6'3" and 250 pounds. There's really not many other weapons out there that can level the playing field between men and women like a firearm can.
Mayor, I want to bring you in, and then Simone, you have a lot, I'm sure, that you want to say in response. But
Also,
Mayor,
Chris,
please.
thank
Yeah.
you, because both of those examples are great examples, right? But my focus is illegal firearms, these people who have these illegal firearms that are doing these mass shootings. Those two examples that you talked about are perfect examples of someone who their Second Amendment, they're doing what they have to do for themselves, and we shouldn't violate their Second Amendment. That's not something that I advocate for, to violate that person's Second Amendment, because they're doing it because they have to defend themselves. But back to the initial question, it's like, why are we comparing, self-defense with guns? What happened, and I hate that I'm saying this, but when I was in school, people didn't have guns. People would fist fight. That doesn't exist anymore. Like, these kids want to come out with guns. Where are they getting these guns from?
Mayor, I hear that, but I also hear your hesitancy. The good old days when we just beat each other up with fists.
And I hate that I say that, but that's going to happen, right? Because not everybody's happy. There's issues that happen. People are not happy with each other. Why does it have to take a gun? Like, why does someone have to have a gun if they're upset at someone and just take out that gun at that person? That person that was killed here in Central Falls, he was playing basketball with a bunch of youth.
Thank you, Mayor. Simone, you a lot to say, but please.
I'll try and be brief because I'm sure there's a lot of great questions to get to. But I take the mayor's point, right, about changing social norms around firearms. And I think that it's important to note that there's a collective action problem here, right? The more people that arm themselves, the more rational it becomes to arm oneself. The greater the likelihood that someone that I encounter has a gun, the greater the reason that I have to carry a gun. And so we're in a kind of arms race as a society. And I think that's where the question of regulation becomes really pertinent, because that seems to be one of the only kind of measures that we have to stop this thing in its track. But I also I wanted to just speak to the question of gender and gun violence here, because I think that, a couple of times stuff's been thrown about, around about guns being equalizers between men and women. That's been kind of glib, like that's traded on the fact that we have smaller frames, kind of defenseless creatures, absent guns. And I find that that stuff a bit disingenuous, because we know, based on the society that we live in, that the people who are attracted to guns, who are more likely to own guns, who are more likely to use guns, are more likely to be men. And that far from being equalizers in relationships between men and women, guns are force multipliers for men. Women account for the vast majority of people killed and shot by domestic partners. Every 16 hours in the United States, a woman is fatally shot by a current or former intimate partner. And so I think there's an important empirical question here about how guns and gender norms and gender socialization interact. And I think we should be careful about glibly supposing that you know, the proliferation of guns is something that's going to be good for women, or that's going to enable them to greater self-defense in a society where they've traditionally been subjected to gender-based violence.
Thanks so much, Simone. We do have a lot of questions, so I'm going to pivot to the next one. The next one is a little philosophical, and Clark, I'm lobbing this one first to you because it's directed at you, but it's a really interesting one, and so I thought we would wrestle with it. And for those listening, forgive us, but there are there are some deep waters here that we've already uncovered. But I like this one. So this is a question that's coming from Max. And the question is this: Clark says that carrying a gun doesn't infringe anyone's rights. It merely might infringe rights. It seems like a non-standard understanding of rights from a libertarian perspective. Nozick, for example, acknowledges that we should have a right to prevent people from inflicting risks on us. For example, when someone drives around blind drunk, we take it that this person is infringing the rights of other people not to be put at risk, even if the drunk driver doesn't actually hit anyone. Likewise, you might think that putting guns in the hands of certain people, for example, those who wouldn't pass certain background checks, inflicts risks on others. Do you deny that drunk drivers are violating the rights of others? I presume that, in parentheses, regardless of whether they hit someone or not. Or do you want to explain the difference between putting people at risk with your car and putting people at risk with your gun? I think that there's a lot there to explore. Clark, do you want to take us away?
I appreciate that. I do want to say really quickly to Simone's earlier point, there is a study from the Harvard School of Public Health that says that between 2019 and 2021, half of all gun purchases were by women, and women are actually the largest, the fastest growing group of new gun owners in the country. So I think that there are many women out there who do not see it the same way. The idea that guns are force multipliers for men and not of much use to women. That's not consistent with the empirical data. To the point about this question of whether carrying a gun violates somebody's rights, I do understand that people feel like they are at greater risk. Some people feel like they're at greater risk if they're around people who are armed. But it's important to realize the slippery slope that we get on here. Like I personally support laws against drunk driving. I think they make sense. I also support laws against throwing rocks off of highway overpasses, even though you're not trying to kill anybody, it just increases the risk. But it's all a question of degree, right? Should we support laws, for example, that say that nobody can walk while holding a smartphone because that increases risk? Or you can't drive a car until you're 25 or 26 years old because younger people tend to be more dangerous drivers. And we could even talk about this in the context of speech. There are some incredibly dangerous, horrible ideas that have been expressed in history that have resulted in tens of millions of deaths, through revolution, genocide, and otherwise. And so in some sense, there are many rights, the exercise of which plausibly present a risk to other people. And I think that anybody who thinks that you can somehow, sort of laser focus on guns and say, well, all those other things are different, but guns really they're categorically different from any other right. And so just somebody carrying a gun peacefully represents a violation of my rights because it's such an acute risk. It's not borne out by the empirical data. Let me just give you a couple of quick statistics. The case that was argued in the U.S. Supreme Court yesterday involved New York gun laws. There are about 60,000 lawfully registered guns in New York City. That is 60,000. The United States Department of Justice estimates that there are 2 million guns in New York City. But here's the really interesting thing. Almost none of those guns went bang last year or in any other year. That's a really remarkable point that I think doesn't get sufficient attention. 2 million guns is how many guns DOJ estimates are in New York City, and hardly any of them are ever used to do anything illegal. And that's why I say that empirically, I understand the sort of the gut level concern about the risk that guns present, but empirically it is simply not borne out. They are not categorically distinct from motor vehicles that still kill more people than guns or drugs or other things that create risk in society, and that we have to try to bring an enlightened public policy to. Guns are like anything else. They can be risky in the wrong hands. They should be those policies should be carefully tailored, but they're not categorically distinct in that no other right that you could exercise under the Constitution presents any threat to people. Many of them do.
Simone, Mayor Rivera, did you want to respond to Clark's position on this?
So I feel like, we've mentioned the LGBTQ community and I'm now comparing drunk drivers. These are different topics, right? The LGBTQ community doesn't put people at harm or at risk. Drunk drivers, that's a whole different conversation compared to guns. It's two separate conversations that we should be having. And I don't think we should be comparing them.
Do you think, Mayor, I'm just trying to sort of unpack some of your position. Do you think that widespread gun possession makes, I'm trying to put this in the spirit of the question that was asked, produces a riskier society?
Absolutely.
You do. And so it sounds like you're sympathetic against Clark with the line that this is a riskier. Is that right?
Well, and especially in a community like mine where these acts of violence that are happening, it's with our youth. So because this is what they tend to go to now, guns.
Simone, did you want to jump in? And then Chris?
No, I mean, I'm fine. I think I'm sympathetic with the questioner, and I'm also sympathetic with Nozick. And I'd, rather that there were a social agency to take care of self-defense than that be a responsibility vested primarily in me as a citizen. But I think that the analogy is a fair one. I'd say in response to Clark, I do think that the question of risk distribution is an important question to ask. But I'll hand over.
Thanks. Chris, we can go on to the next question, but I wanted to give you a chance to speak to this if you'd like. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I know we're a little short on time. Why don't we move on, please?
Okay, great. So let me choose. There continues to be a lot of good stuff. Some of this is a little bit more practical. So this one was theoretical. Let me balance it with something more practical. And I think the practical one that I'd like to bring in here is this. This is from one of the listeners, OG, and they say this: for at least 2 decades, I've watched the sides debate, but given a stalemate politically, virtually no good policies put in place. The mayor mentioned some, but why is it so hard to find partners across the aisle to address some of the other relevant issues such as mental health treatment, training, poverty, etc.? Given that suicide is the greatest impact on gun violence, why cannot both political sides work together on funding more on suicide prevention? It all feels very cynical. I don't see the Republicans backing funding for alternative approaches either. They mention mental health, but won't fund improving mental health care. What does it take to bring folks together to the table? I think that's a good practical question to ask. Mayor, this is a question about politics. Let me start with you on this.
We have to take it upon ourselves. I think we have to be realistic to what's happening and why these issues are happening, which is like mental health. It's a conversation that's not happening. So we're trying to find a solution to something without having the conversation of what's triggering this, which is why I've taken it upon myself here in Central Falls to work with our police department, to work with our youth and try to engage them in different conversations. I had a youth police academy so that the youth can come in and learn about what the police department does, because everything that has happened with the Black Lives Matter, that has triggered people to shoot each other. So the conversations and education about why these things are happening are not enough. This is going to continue happening so we can work on legislation, which I agree with the legislation. But besides that, we need, like my city, what I'm doing it because this is something I want to do, not because the state is funding this. So these conversations need to happen. It's an important conversation. We need the support from the leaders at the state level, from the leaders at the national level to start having these conversations and working on these issues, because we can work on legislation, but if we don't work at the root of the problem, it's going to continue happening.
Thank you. Chris, you spent a lot of time in the public sphere as well. What do you think could bring people together on some of this stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing is back to an earlier comment I made about how much time and energy, both Republicans and Democrats spend, right, every single session in Congress, right, debating gun control legislation. I think from a gun rights perspective, we're often having to be on our back foot, right? We're having to defend and debate and discuss and fight these gun control measures. And it happens almost every single year, right, at the federal and the state and the local level. And all of this fighting, right, the polarization, right, in our country is higher than ever. And these unfortunately are not civil, right, debates or discussions at the political sort of level of things, which is really unfortunate. That's obviously a whole kind of another conversation. But my point is that the polarization, it breaks down trust. And I think it's preventing us from moving on to, talking about other potential solutions. But again, every time, right, we talk about, trying to reduce gun violence, gun control is immediately front and center. And then, right, the gun rights side, we have to invest so much time and energy defending our civil liberties and our Second Amendment rights that there just is no time, right? There's no time, money, energy, or effort, right, to really dig deep into community-based solutions, into mental health and medical-based solutions as well. So, I think the gun debate, unfortunately, is the problems we're seeing is symptomatic of a lot of the political dysfunction that we're seeing here in our country over the past, 10, 20 years.
Chris, I wanted to just have a quick follow-up with you because I know we spoke about this earlier and put this out there as well. And then Clark and Simone, I'll bring you in. But political dysfunction, yes, and of course, the media. I always am hesitant to talk about the media because it's like, I mean, it's almost a meaningless term at this point. But the way that this conversation often happens publicly, I know that you have strong views about certain impoverishment of the way that this conversation happens and the way that it's often portrayed in the media. Is that contributing to some of the stalemate as well? Do you want to say a few words about what you think might enrich the public conversation in general?
Yeah, I mean, let me kind of tell a parallel story here, regarding my involvement with the Asian American community and gun rights and firearms safety and education. So, 2 years at the start of the pandemic, we started, the Asian American community, we started to see this very acute rise in violence, racist violence against innocent Asian Americans all across our country. Some of the most despicable acts being committed against the elderly members of the Asian American community. And so, a year went by and none of the mainstream media outlets were really covering this. And all of a sudden, at the beginning of this year, it just exploded, right, in terms of media coverage, highlighting all of these heinous attacks against the Asian American community. And for about maybe 6 months, right, the first 6 months of this year, like there was a lot of coverage about Asian American, violence against our community. And now you don't see that coverage anymore, yet it's still, the violence still exists. And I think there's a similar dynamic here with firearms violence that every time there's some kind of shooting, we see it on TV, right? Now, if you think for a moment, well, if we didn't see the media reporting out on every single shooting that happens all the time, then maybe we wouldn't think this is as big of a problem as it maybe is. Now, I'm not saying it's not a problem. It's just sort of, well, what's the actual data? What's the order of magnitude impacting, either us as an individual or our communities at large? And so, yeah, the media, right, has a role to play here to balance the reporting with respect to, how frequently are these types of attacks, whether they're racist attacks against Asian Americans or there's just gang shootings, mass shootings, whatever kind of firearms related violence that's happening out there in our world. And the media, they have a tough job, right? They have to report on the truth, but there's a lot of things going on, and I think we just need to be aware of balancing what we see and what we don't see in the media, stack that up against the facts, and then try and make an informed decision about what we all think should be our path forward to resolve the violence that we're seeing in our country.
Great, Simone and Clark, I'm going to give you a chance to chime in if you'd like, and then we've only got like 9 minutes, and I want to have time to close some things up, but I do have a good, possibly closing question. But Simone, let me turn to you. Is there anything you want to speak to in this space?
Well, maybe one thing that hasn't been mentioned so far, but I think is worth noting, is the fact that guns aren't politically neutral, and that they actually are often associated with people's political identity. Gun owner is a kind of the status that you can have, and it's one that maybe connects you with a social group. And I think that's important because when we're talking about changing America's gun culture, or talking about gun control, platforms, it's really important to be sensitive to the fact that people organize around the idea of being gun owners, that people have social identities that are connected to being gun owners, that hunting and shooting are social activities. And this is part of the fabric of social life for a lot of Americans. And so when people hear, we're coming for your guns, they hear we're coming for your social and political identity as well. And so anyone who wants to see meaningful gun reform in this country has to contend with that fact, and has to contend with the fact that there are groups of people for whom being a gun owner is a politically potent tribal identity. And we have to be sensitive to that and think about the ways in which guns connect people, as well as the ways in which they contribute to polarization and violence and the other things that we're concerned about.
Thanks, Simone. Clark, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, just really quickly, I think that part of the problem is that oftentimes I find that people who are very pro-gun regulation seem to be, they're surprisingly unknowledgeable about many of the issues involved. So just to take an example, we mentioned defensive gun uses before. I've run into very few people who could even give you an estimate about where the scholarly consensus is about the number of times that people use guns to defend themselves successfully in this country. Another example would be, have guns ever been used to stop mass shootings? And the answer is absolutely yes. Very few people, I suspect, could even name one example where that's happened, and they certainly couldn't tell you the last time that it's happened. So, cars, for example, as I mentioned before, they kill more people every year than guns, but there's no talk about trying to get rid of them or dial back the number of sports cars that people can own. We know that cars are really, really useful. We do have common sense automobile laws, just like we have common sense gun laws. And I think what's important in trying to reduce the amount of toxic polarization surrounding this and any other issue is that if you're going to take a strong position that will result in the infringement of somebody's liberty, in the restriction of their freedom, it's really important that we all commit to making sure that we understand why that other person believes what they believe, and really make an honest effort to try to determine which of those facts seem to be supported, which of them are not supported, and which of them are debatable. I find that there's a paucity of effort in that area oftentimes, and I think that generates some of the ill feeling, is that people feel like they're not respected because the people who are trying to infringe on their liberty haven't taken the time and the effort to really get up to speed and master the relevant facts.
So this last question, we've only got 5 minutes, so it's going to have to be one of those lightning rounds, and it's absolutely not really good for a lightning round, but I wanted to put it in front of you all the same. This comes from Amelia, and her question is, how would each of you go about rewriting the Second Amendment? And maybe part of that is, would you go about rewriting the Second Amendment? But I like that as an interesting thought experiment. How would each of you go about, if you would, rewriting the Second Amendment? Anyone want to volunteer to take that one first? Woo. Okay.
That's a tough one, because I think we're also focused on whether we support or whether we not support the Second Amendment, but we really don't think about, if we were in that position, what we would put in the Second Amendment, right? And can I just say, I agree with Clark. I think communication is key, and it's important for us to hear from each other and understand why they have a certain take on this position.
Okay, that's a good start to this.
Yeah, so I'd like to chime in. I mean, I think the clarifying parts that I would rewrite, there's been a number of confusing either clauses or phrases or words in the Second Amendment. The first one is militia. Right. So, militia back then, it's sort of just unclear, right? What did the founders mean exactly by militia? The DC versus Heller decision back in 2008 that Clark, represented and mentioned, very much kind of clarified what that was, but it took us a long time, right, to kind of get to that clarity of militia. I would say the second part is about the right of the people to keep and bear arms, right? What does keep and bear arms really mean? I think that could have used some clarification. And then I think the shall not be infringed piece. I think it would have been helpful to understand, why is this the only amendment to have this phrase shall not be infringed? And what did the founders really intend by that? And I think rewriting that or adding clarity to that phrase clause would be extremely helpful and possibly reduce a lot of the debate and discussion that we have today. But the Second Amendment was written as it was written.
Simone, Clark.
I'll defer to the constitutional scholar.
Yeah, I mean, I think that clearly there's a lot of disagreement and confusion over the significance of the so-called militia clause. A lot of you don't know this, but every man who's watching this at home or wherever you are, you may not know this, but you have been in the unarmed or the unorganized militia of the United States since the day you turned 17. It has nothing to do with the selective service. You weren't asked, and you will be in the unorganized militia of the United States until you turn 45. So militia is definitely—
I'm out, Clark. I'm done.
Same here. I'm out. But anyway, so I think it would clarify a lot that to simply delete that provision. There's a lot of misunderstanding about why the militia clause is there. Again, I think not many people have really dug into the history. Very clearly, it was put there by James Madison in an effort to respond to concern on the part of anti-federalists who felt that the allocation of responsibility between the federal and state governments when it comes to the control of the militia when it is called out. They didn't like that allocation of responsibility. That's what the clause is doing there. But I would just delete it, not because I think that it in any way detracts or diminishes from the operative clause, which is that the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, but it's an anachronism like other prefatory clauses, which were quite common in that area. You can look in state constitutions and see dozens of prefatory clauses. They're never given any significant substance or meaning. And I would either delete it or I would just put a little asterisk that says, treat this prefatory clause just like all other constitutional prefatory clauses, meaning nothing, and be consistent in the way that you treat this prefatory clause to the way you treat other ones, which is to say, don't give it any effect. That's the way all prefatory clauses were treated back then. That's the way they're supposed to be treated now. But again, I think people have sort of fetishized this one because it sort of appears to give them a hook to constrain the scope of the operative clause that many people just don't agree with, which is perfectly understandable. But I don't believe there's any ambiguity in the amendment, but I know some people do, and we could clarify that by just deleting the prefatory clause.
Thanks, Clark. We have about 1 minute to go. Simone, the floor is yours. You get the last word.
Well, maybe provocatively, I'll reorganize it so that the Second Amendment reads, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state shall not be infringed, and drop what Clark is calling the operative clause, but which many of us don't take to be such.
All right. We're at the bell. There's so much more to say. I want to encourage all listeners as well to dig into the data that folks have discussed here and explore it and challenge it and question it and mull it over and continue to engage. I just want to thank our panelists so much for a wonderful hour and a half. It's been great. This sort of thing. I wish we had another hour and a half to go. Ninha, I know that you want to wrap things up. I think so. It's just a goodbye. So from me, though, to all the panelists, thank you for a wonderful exchange of ideas civilly. And we really did disagree, and that's important as well. Ninha, do you have a final thought?
No, thank you very much. First, I just want to thank a number of people here. First, I just want to thank members of our staff for helping to make today's event possible, and to Chris, to you for facilitating this panel and really helping to bring out the nature of disagreement and to really encourage us to engage in it in a civil way. And so thank you to our panelists, Chris Chang, Simone Grubler, Clark Neely, and Maria Rivera for sharing your experiences, explaining and defending your views, and for engaging with one another in our audience with real candor and civility over an issue that is something that clearly people feel strongly about and can be deeply divisive. And I also want to thank the audience for your questions and attendance. I saw in a number of comments how much you appreciated the discussion, and the Civil Disagreement series was started to bring together people who do disagree and to model thoughtful and respectful engagement over what are pressing issues. And so your interest and engagement are reminders that there are many of us who really do share a desire to engage in respectful engagement over deeply divisive issues. And then finally, I want to thank the Intercollegiate Civil Disagreement Partnership Fellows. Your desire not just to engage in these civil discussions, but also wanting to help model and facilitate these sorts of discussions is from the perspective of an educator, deeply inspiring. And as an educator, I guess I want to add one last thing to the fellows, which is that as you go forward in this work, want to make sure where the disagreement is. Is a disagreement over facts or is it over values? And to interrogate the facts to make sure they're actually working from a common set of facts. Right? So do guns really make people safer? Right? How often are guns used in self-defense? How often are guns used in situations where they're not owned legally? Those are the kinds of facts, right, that I hope you also think focusing on, and not just the disagreement over values as go forward. And so please continue and spread the message. And perhaps you can help us overcome the divisiveness and dysfunction that were mentioned in our discussion and advance our public discussion, because you really are the future. So again, thank you very much to all of you, and thanks for a great discussion. And I really hope that we can continue in this spirit going forward.
Thanks all.
Yeah.